So in the next few parts of this lesson, we're going to consider what I'm calling the SpanglerToinby Model. And the key idea of this is that there is no single world history. There's just individual civilizations, each with its own history. So civilizations can come and go, but there's no overall story of human progress. So this is very different from the thinking of people like Hegel and Marx, for whom history is a single arc of progress from primitive societies to some future utopia of freedom and equality. And instead it's more like the thinking of people like Vico and Ibn Khaldun, that there is a process that societies can go through, a process of rise and fall, and this civilization can go through that process and that civilization can go through the process, but there's no connection between them. We can't say that one society is more or less advanced than the other. And I said we would begin with the thinking of Nikolai Danilevsky, who was the first to express this idea clearly in his book Russia and Europe. So Danilevsky was the first to list different civilizations and the first to express the idea that there is no overall human progress, that civilizations are just different but not better or worse than each other. And he said that each civilization is distinguished from the others by having a particular creative drive that is specific to that civilization and informs everything it does. So Danilevsky said, for example, that British civilization is characterized by the idea of a struggle for existence and the survival of the fittest. And we see these ideas, of course, in the work of Darwin, but Danilevsky pointed out that we also see them in the work of the sociologist or political theorist Thomas Hobbes, with his idea that society is a war of all against all. So for Hobbes, it's all about a struggle between different interest groups, and all social and political institutions express and manage this conflict. And we also see it in the work of the economist Adam Smith, with his emphasis on competition and markets. So Adam Smith talked about the hidden hand of the market, implying that it's competition that brings what buyers are prepared to bid in line with what sellers are prepared to offer, and so allows the economy to work. So Danilevsky would say that these ideas of Hobbes and of Adam Smith and even of Darwin are not necessarily right or wrong. They're not necessarily objectively true. They're just the way a British person would see it. And people from other civilizations might see these things in a different way. So let's have a look at some of his civilizations and their creative drives. So he recognized civilizations of Greece, Rome, Europe, China, and India, and they had these different creative drives according to him. So Greece, he said, was driven by the idea of beauty in their sculpture, in their philosophy. It was all about beauty, ideals of beauty, whereas Rome was all about laws. So Roman law has persisted in Europe down to the present. Europe, he said, was or is driven by the idea of science, understanding the world. And China is driven by issues of practical usefulness. So, for example, China invented the wheelbarrow, things that are practical and useful. And India, he said, is driven by the ideal of mysticism. So, several religions have come out of India: Buddhism, Hinduism, Jainism, and they're all very philosophical about understanding the cosmos and consciousness and humans' role in the universe. And beyond this, Danilevsky identified 5 laws about how civilizations work. So the first one is that civilizations are united by a common language, or at least a language group, related languages. So bearing in mind the close correlation between language and culture, both as symbolic systems, we could say that they have a kind of common cultural background. His second point is that civilizations are politically autonomous, so they have autonomy. So a people can't develop a civilization if they're under the control of some other society or civilization or people. They must have mastery of their own destiny in order to create a separate civilization. Thirdly, he said that there's no copying. They're unique. So, you know, Rome took over some ideas from Greece, but it didn't copy the Greek approach. So there can be influence between societies, but not direct copying. So, you know, Rome had a different way of looking at the world to Greece, and all these civilizations can take ideas from other civilizations, but they have their own unique perspective on the world. And fourthly, he said that they must have some internal diversity to count as a civilization. So this diversity is responsible for that kind of creative friction, that the differences allow ideas to be combined and to generate new ideas. So that diversity allows a civilization to construct itself. And his last point is that they are one-offs, or one shot, let's say. So a civilization only rises and falls once, and it can after it's fallen, it can persist indefinitely after that, but it's never going to rise again. And that period of the peak of civilization, the flowering of a particular civilization, is quite brief, quite short-lived. And in constructing these ideas, Danilevsky was really driven by the need to argue that Russia is not part of European civilization and is instead part of a Slavic civilization that he said was 500 years behind European civilization. But that didn't mean it was backward, it's just operating on a different timetable. It got started later and it will finish later. So he saw in his time that Europe was already at the peak, or maybe a little bit past the peak of its own civilization, and was now heading into decline. But the Slavic civilization he saw as having its peak still to come in the future. So it had a bright future ahead of it. So he was really arguing against the ideas of someone like Peter the Great, who in the 17th and 18th century saw Russia as lagging behind the rest of Europe, and tried to, well, he went abroad to Europe and learned the techniques in Europe of things like shipbuilding, and brought them back to Russia to try and get Russia to catch up with Europe. And what Danilevsky is saying is no, Russia doesn't need to catch up with Europe because it's entirely separate from Europe. It's a different civilization. It's a Slavic civilization, and it will go through its own process of rise and fall. And he said it's because Russia is part of a separate Slavic civilization, that there is this inevitable hostility of Europe towards Russia. So he saw Europe as always being hostile to Russia and always invading it, like Napoleon, without justification in his view. And he thought, well, Russia's never really done anything to offend Europe, but it's always being attacked by Europe in the Crimean War as well. So he sort of reassured himself that the reason for this is because we here in Russia, we are a separate civilization, and so this kind of hostility is just what we should expect. It seems unfair, but it's just because we are a separate civilization. And the good news is that those Europeans are now on their way down. We are still on our way up. We've still got 500 years before we get to their peak and then decay. And all these ideas are very much opposed by Pitirim Sorokin, who lived, a generation or two after Danilevsky. For Sorokin, Russia is part of European civilization, and he acknowledged that Russia does seem to lag 200 or 300 years behind Europe in every field, like art and music and literature and science and legal systems. But he said that, though, if you look at what's happening, Russia is catching up fast. So for Sorokin, it was appropriate for Russia to catch up with Europe, and he thought that it indeed was doing so. So very much the opposite of Danilevsky's point of view. And the historian James Feibleman has said about Danilevsky's theory that if we're studying theoretical history, we need to be objective, and we can't have an agenda. And Danilevsky very much did have this agenda, this attempt to argue that Russia was, the nexus of a future glorious civilization, and he had plans for it. He had the idea that it should incorporate all the Orthodox people of the Orthodox faith, so the Greeks as well, and should establish its capital at Constantinople in the future. So he had a definite plan for where this Slavic civilization of his was going to go. Well, Feibleman says, that's a bias, that therefore means we can't really accept his theory. But although clearly there is that bias in it, we can still, find these ideas interesting and take what's good about them and build a theory around that. And that's what Oswald Spengler tried to do, and that's who we'll be considering in the next part of this lesson.